You have to understand something most people never truly confront in their lives, and it is this simple but uncomfortable truth. Your entire life is nothing more than the sum of what you repeatedly do in the moments when you already knew what needed to be done, but still chose to delay it. This is where everything begins, and this is where almost everyone silently fails without even realizing it. Not because they are incapable, not because they lack intelligence, and not because they don't have opportunities, but because there is always a gap between awareness and action. And in that gap, most people lose themselves. They think knowing is enough. They think planning is progress. They think thinking about doing something is a step forward. But in reality, thinking without execution is just mental entertainment. It feels productive, but produces nothing in the real world. Now imagine the mind like a battlefield where every moment a command is issued. You either obey immediately or you negotiate. And the moment you begin to negotiate with yourself, you lose authority over your own life. You say things like, I will do it later, I will start tomorrow, I will wait until I feel ready, I need more time, I need better conditions, I need motivation. And every one of these phrases sounds harmless, even reasonable, but collectively they build a personality that is trained in hesitation. A person who hesitates enough times eventually becomes someone who cannot move without emotional permission. That is the real prison. Not physical limitations, but psychological delay. The discipline of immediate action is not about being perfect or never feeling resistance. It is about refusing to let resistance sit in the driver's seat, because resistance will always be there. Your mind will always try to protect you from discomfort, from uncertainty, from effort, from risk. That is its natural design. But your life is not designed by comfort, it is designed by what you do despite discomfort. And this is where the shift happens, when you stop asking your mind how it feels about something and instead start commanding it based on what must be done. Think about the smallest example. Something as simple as a task you know you need to complete, a conversation you know you need to have, a decision you know you need to make. Most people in that moment enter a loop. They think about it, they analyze it, they imagine outcomes, they feel emotional weight, and instead of reducing the pressure, they multiply it. Because inaction does not eliminate stress, it amplifies it. The longer you delay something, the heavier it becomes in your mind. And what could have been a simple action becomes a psychological burden. But when a person develops immediate action as a habit, something completely different begins to happen internally. The mind stops building unnecessary narratives around tasks. It stops inflating problems. It stops creating emotional resistance. Because it learns a new pattern: thought equals execution. No discussion, no delay, no emotional debate, just movement. And in that simplicity, there is power that most people underestimate. You see, discipline is not built in grand moments where you feel inspired and decide to change your life. Discipline is built in the invisible seconds where you either obey your intention or betray it. And every time you choose delay, you are not just postponing a task, you are reinforcing an identity. You are telling your subconscious mind that your words do not require immediate action, that your intentions are flexible, that your decisions are optional. Over time, this creates a fragmented identity where a person starts to distrust themselves. They say things but don't follow through. They plan things but don't execute. They start things but don't finish. And slowly, without noticing, they stop believing in their own capability. But immediate action reverses this entire internal structure. Because every time you act the moment you decide, you send a signal to your brain that you are someone who follows through. And that signal is more powerful than motivation. Motivation is unstable. It rises and falls. But identity is stable. It is built through repetition. And when repetition is aligned with immediate execution, something very dangerous in a positive sense begins to develop. You become predictable in your discipline. And when you are predictable in your discipline, you become unstoppable in your outcomes. There is also something deeper happening here that most people never consider. Every time you act immediately, you reduce the emotional weight of future actions. Because your mind learns that tasks are not threats, they are simply instructions. And when tasks stop feeling like threats, procrastination loses its foundation. Procrastination does not survive in a mind that does not fear action. It only survives in a mind that overthinks action. And overthinking is the real enemy here. Not laziness, not lack of intelligence, but the illusion of productivity that thinking creates. A person can sit for hours thinking about changing their life, planning their future, imagining success, analyzing possibilities, and still remain completely unchanged in reality. Because transformation does not happen in mental simulations, it happens in physical execution. You cannot think your way into a new identity. You act your way into it. Now consider how rare immediate action actually is in today's world. Most people are trained to consume information endlessly. They watch, they read, they scroll, they learn, but very few actually convert any of it into action at the exact moment it is needed. That gap between knowing and doing has become the standard human condition. But within that gap lies separation. On one side are people who remain stuck in cycles of intention without execution, and on the other side are people who collapse that gap completely, who move the moment clarity appears, who do not allow hesitation to take root long enough to grow into resistance. And here is the uncomfortable truth that most avoid. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your execution speed. Because execution speed determines whether your ideas become reality or remain thoughts that fade away over time. A slow executor will always lose to a fast actor, even if the fast actor is less talented. Because speed creates momentum, and momentum compounds faster than intelligence alone ever could. So, when you start practicing immediate action, you begin to notice something subtle but powerful. Your confidence increases, not because you are affirming yourself, but because you are proving yourself. Every small action taken instantly becomes evidence that you are reliable to yourself. And self-trust is the foundation of all strength. Without self-trust, confidence is artificial. With self-trust, confidence becomes automatic. And slowly the identity shifts. You stop seeing yourself as someone who tries. You stop seeing yourself as someone who hopes. You stop seeing yourself as someone who plans endlessly. Instead, you become someone who responds, someone who moves, someone who executes. And that transformation is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is not emotional. It is structural. It changes how your mind processes reality at the most fundamental level, because now your brain no longer separates thought from action. It merges them into a single continuous process where intention is immediately followed by movement without hesitation or internal debate. And over time, this rewires your entire perception of what is possible, because the distance between idea and reality becomes shorter and shorter until it almost disappears, and everything you decide starts to manifest in behavior instantly without resistance forming in the background. And this creates a kind of internal acceleration where life stops feeling like something you are preparing for and starts feeling like something you are actively shaping in real time through consistent, unbroken execution that does not wait for conditions to be perfect or emotions to align or fear to disappear, but instead operates from a baseline assumption that action is always the correct first response, regardless of how uncertain or uncomfortable the moment may appear, which eventually leads into a state where hesitation itself feels unnatural and almost foreign, because the brain has been trained through repetition to reject delay at the very moment it begins to form, and instead convert every intention directly into movement without allowing space for doubt to build. And that is where the shift continues to deepen beyond behavior into identity itself, where you no longer describe yourself as someone trying to become disciplined, but instead operate as someone for whom discipline is the default operating system of every decision and every response and every moment of awareness in daily life, which continues to evolve as this pattern reinforces itself through every action taken without delay, shaping not just what you do, but how you perceive time, opportunity, pressure, and possibility in a continuous unfolding state of execution that does not pause for reflection long enough to break its own momentum. Most people completely misunderstand what actually builds power in a human life. They think it is intensity. They think it is big moments, dramatic decisions, sudden bursts of motivation where everything changes overnight. But that is not how real transformation works. Real transformation is not born in moments of excitement. It is built in moments of repetition that feel ordinary, even boring, even meaningless in the short term. And this is exactly why so many people fail. They are addicted to intensity but allergic to consistency. They can push themselves hard for a short period, but they cannot sustain simple actions over a long period of time. And life does not reward intensity. Life rewards repetition. Ruthless consistency in small actions is not glamorous. It does not feel powerful in the beginning. In fact, it feels almost too simple to matter. Wake up and do the task. Repeat it tomorrow. Repeat it again the next day. Show up even when no one is watching. Show up even when there is no immediate reward. Show up even when your emotions are telling you that it doesn't matter today. And this is where most people collapse, because they believe that if something does not feel significant, it must not be valuable. But the truth is the opposite. The smallest actions, when repeated without interruption, become the foundation of everything that looks impressive from the outside. Think about any person you consider successful, any person who appears disciplined, focused, powerful, or ahead of others. What you are seeing is not a collection of big moments. You are seeing the result of thousands of small actions that were repeated without negotiation. The difference is not that they always felt like doing it. The difference is that they removed feeling from the equation. They stopped asking, do I feel like it today, and started asking, is this what I do now regardless of how I feel? That shift alone separates average lives from extraordinary ones. Most people underestimate how dangerous inconsistency really is. They think skipping one day does not matter. They think breaking a routine here and there is harmless. But inconsistency does not just pause progress, it weakens identity. Every time you say you will do something and you don't, you are not just missing an action, you are teaching your brain that your word is flexible. And a flexible word becomes a weak identity. Eventually, the mind stops respecting your own intentions. You start negotiating with yourself more easily. You start delaying more often. You start doubting more frequently. And slowly, without realizing it, you become someone who trusts ideas more than actions. But ruthless consistency breaks that pattern completely. It removes negotiation. It removes emotional dependency. It removes the illusion that you need to feel ready. Instead, it installs a new internal rule. If it is part of the process, it gets done no matter what. Not because it is exciting, not because it is convenient, but because it is required. And when something becomes required rather than optional, your entire psychology begins to reorganize itself around it. There is a hidden truth here that most people never fully grasp. Success is not created by what you do occasionally. It is created by what you refuse to stop doing. That is the real difference. Anyone can do something once. Anyone can act on motivation. Anyone can push hard for a short burst of time. But very few people can maintain boring, repetitive actions when there is no external pressure forcing them to continue. That is where the real separation happens. Because consistency is not tested when you are motivated. It is tested when nothing is happening, when progress feels invisible, when effort feels unacknowledged, and when the mind starts asking why this even matters. In those moments, most people quit quietly, not because they made a conscious decision to give up, but because they allowed small breaks to become habits. One missed day becomes two. Two becomes a pattern. And before long, the entire structure collapses, not because it was weak, but because it was not protected. Consistency is fragile in the beginning. It must be defended aggressively until it becomes identity. And here is where the real power of small actions begins to reveal itself. Small actions are deceptive. They look insignificant in isolation. One workout, one page, one call, one practice session, one moment of discipline does not feel like it changes anything. But repetition changes everything. Because the human brain is not built to measure progress in single events. It is built to adapt to patterns. And when a pattern is repeated enough times, it becomes automatic. And when something becomes automatic, it no longer requires effort. It becomes part of who you are. This is why ruthless consistency is more powerful than bursts of effort. Because bursts require emotional fuel. Consistency removes the need for fuel. It becomes mechanical, almost instinctive. You don't think about brushing your teeth every day. You don't debate it. You don't need motivation for it. It is simply what you do. And that is exactly how discipline should operate at a higher level. Not as a struggle, but as a default response. Most people live in cycles of starting and stopping. They start when they feel inspired, then stop when life becomes inconvenient. And every time they restart, they lose momentum, because restarting is always harder than continuing. The real advantage in life is not starting faster, it is never having to restart at all. And that only comes through consistency that does not break. There is also a psychological transformation that happens when you maintain small actions without interruption. Your relationship with effort changes. At first, effort feels heavy. It feels like something you have to push yourself into. But over time, as consistency builds, effort becomes lighter. Not because the task becomes easier, but because resistance decreases. The mind stops resisting what it knows will happen anyway. And when resistance drops, energy is preserved. And when energy is preserved, execution becomes smoother. This is how people become what others call disciplined. Not through force, but through repetition that removes internal conflict. The less you argue with yourself, the more energy you have for actual performance. And the more you perform, the stronger the identity becomes. It becomes a cycle that reinforces itself. Action builds identity. Identity reinforces action. And consistency is the bridge between the two. But the real challenge is not understanding this intellectually. Most people already know they should be consistent. The challenge is execution in moments where there is no pressure, no audience, no consequence for stopping. That is where character is formed. Not in public, not in competition, but in private decisions that no one sees. The decision to continue when nothing external is forcing you to continue is the highest form of discipline. And once that pattern locks in, something fundamental shifts. You stop needing external motivation. You stop waiting for perfect conditions. You stop searching for inspiration. Because your identity is no longer dependent on emotional states. It is built on behavior. And behavior, when consistent enough, becomes permanent structure. At that point, you are no longer someone who tries to be consistent. You become someone who simply is consistent. And that distinction changes everything about how you operate in the world, because now your actions are no longer random responses to motivation, but a continuous expression of a stabilized internal system that does not fluctuate based on mood or circumstance, but instead maintains its direction regardless of external noise or temporary discomfort, allowing every small action to accumulate into something far greater than its individual weight suggests, and creating a compounding effect where repetition stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like the natural rhythm of how you exist in daily life, where skipping becomes more difficult than continuing and stopping feels more unnatural than moving forward, and the entire structure of your behavior aligns itself so tightly with consistency that the idea of breaking it begins to feel incompatible with your identity itself. There is a moment in every human life where everything stops being theoretical, where your ideas, your discipline, your confidence, your plans, all of it is no longer tested in comfort but in pressure. And in that moment, what matters is not what you believe about yourself when things are calm, but what you become when things are unstable. Because pressure does not create weakness, it reveals it. And it also reveals strength, but only the kind of strength that has been trained, not imagined. Mastery of mental control under pressure is not something you are born with. It is not a personality trait. It is not luck. It is a trained response to discomfort. Most people assume that successful individuals are naturally calm, naturally confident, naturally in control. But that is an illusion created by repetition. What you are seeing is not natural stability, it is practice stability. It is the result of someone who has repeatedly placed themselves in situations where emotional reaction would have been easier, but control was chosen instead. The average person loses themselves the moment pressure appears. Their thinking becomes scattered. Their emotions take over their decisions. They react instead of respond. And in that reaction, they create more chaos. A single stressful situation turns into multiple problems because the mind is no longer directing the body, the emotion is. And when emotion takes control, logic becomes secondary. That is where mistakes are made. Not because people lack intelligence, but because they lose access to it under stress. But there is another level of human behavior that most people never reach. It is the ability to remain internally stable while everything externally is unstable. It is the ability to observe pressure without becoming pressure, to experience discomfort without being controlled by discomfort. This is not suppression. It is awareness combined with discipline. It is the ability to see what is happening internally without allowing it to dictate external action. And this is where true power begins. Because once you are no longer reactive, you become strategic. And strategy only exists in a calm mind. A panicked mind cannot calculate. It can only escape, react, or freeze. But a controlled mind can evaluate, decide, and execute with precision, even in uncertain conditions. Think about how most people operate when things go wrong. Something unexpected happens, and immediately their emotional state shifts. Their breathing changes, their focus narrows, their thoughts become repetitive and chaotic. They begin to assume worst-case scenarios. They begin to lose clarity. And in that state, even simple decisions feel overwhelming. This is the default human response under pressure. But it is not the highest possible response. It is just the most common one. The highest response is stillness inside movement. It is the ability to keep your internal state steady while still taking action externally. It is not about ignoring pressure. It is about refusing to amplify it, because pressure itself is neutral. It is your interpretation of pressure that creates suffering. Two people can experience the same situation, but only one breaks under it. The difference is not the situation. The difference is internal control. Mental control under pressure is built through exposure, not avoidance. Most people try to avoid difficult situations. They try to stay in comfort zones. They try to minimize emotional discomfort. But avoidance does not build strength. It delays the moment of collapse. Because eventually pressure arrives in life regardless of preparation. And when it arrives unexpectedly, it hits harder than it would have if it had been trained for. The individual who trains under pressure becomes familiar with it. Familiarity removes fear. When something is unfamiliar, the mind exaggerates its danger. But when something has been experienced repeatedly, the mind begins to normalize it. And what is normalized is no longer threatening. This is why controlled exposure to difficulty is essential. Not to suffer, but to build familiarity with discomfort so that it no longer controls behavior. There is a critical distinction here that must be understood. Control is not the absence of emotion. Control is the ability to operate despite emotion. You will still feel stress. You will still feel uncertainty. You will still feel pressure. But those feelings no longer get to decide your actions. They exist in the background while your decisions remain in the foreground. Most people believe that strong individuals do not feel fear. That is incorrect. Strong individuals feel fear but do not obey it. They acknowledge it internally but override it externally. That override is where discipline lives. Not in the absence of emotional signals, but in the refusal to let those signals dictate direction. And this is where repetition becomes critical again. Because mental control is not a one-time decision. It is a repeated choice made under varying levels of stress. Every time pressure appears and you choose stability instead of reaction, you reinforce a pattern. And that pattern eventually becomes automatic. At first, control requires effort. Later, it becomes instinct. There is also a deeper layer to this. When you maintain control under pressure, you begin to trust yourself in environments where others lose themselves. And that self-trust becomes a form of internal authority. You no longer question whether you can handle difficult situations because you have evidence that you can. And evidence is more powerful than belief. Belief can fluctuate. Evidence is permanent. As this develops, something interesting happens. Your perception of pressure changes entirely. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable, not because the world becomes easier, but because your capacity increases. And capacity is the real source of confidence. Not optimism, not reassurance, but proven ability to remain stable in situations where instability is the norm. At a certain point, pressure stops being something you fear and starts becoming something you understand. You begin to see patterns within chaos. You begin to notice that most stressful situations are temporary distortions rather than permanent realities. And when you can see clearly under pressure, you gain access to decisions that others miss because they are too emotionally involved in the moment. This is the real advantage. Not avoidance of difficulty, but clarity within difficulty. The ability to think when others cannot think. The ability to act when others freeze. The ability to remain aligned with logic when emotion is trying to take control of direction. That is the difference between reaction-based living and control-based living. And as this control deepens, your identity begins to shift again. You stop seeing yourself as someone who is affected by pressure and start seeing yourself as someone who operates within pressure. You are no longer moved by external instability in the same way. You observe it, process it, and continue moving forward without internal collapse. This is not detachment from reality. It is mastery within reality. It is full engagement with life without being emotionally hijacked by it. And that state creates a kind of internal freedom that most people never experience. Because most people are constantly at the mercy of their environment. Their mood shifts with circumstances. Their decisions shift with emotion. Their energy rises and falls based on external validation or external stress. But when mental control is established, that dependency disappears. You become internally governed rather than externally influenced. And that shift changes everything about how you navigate life. Because now, your stability is not something given to you by conditions, but something generated internally regardless of conditions, allowing you to remain steady in situations that would normally destabilize others and continue executing decisions with clarity even when uncertainty is high. And outcomes are unclear, and pressure is increasing, and everything around you is demanding emotional reaction. Yet your internal state remains anchored in control, observation, and deliberate response that is not influenced by chaos, but instead processes chaos as information rather than threat, and continues operating at a level of awareness where emotional turbulence no longer dictates direction, but instead becomes something you can observe without being absorbed into it as your actions continue to align with logic, structure, and purpose, even in the presence of instability that would typically cause most individuals to lose coherence and deviate from their intended path as your mind continues to function with clarity under conditions that would normally dissolve clarity entirely. And your behavior reflects a level of composure that is no longer situational, but foundational, built through repetition, exposure, and deliberate practice under pressure until the state of control becomes the default response rather than the exceptional one. You become unstoppable the moment you stop delaying action, start mastering consistency, and maintain control of your mind under pressure regardless of circumstances.